Good morning, everyone. This is Resham Nawaz, welcoming you all to Foresight 2016, the annual conclave of OTV. The world is changing every moment, and everything around us is changing with it. The character of the world, the country, the state, and our immediate neighborhood is undergoing constant change. OTV, the premier news channel of Odisha, has been organizing Foresight for the last 5 years to deliberate on these changes in our social, economic, political, and cultural life. So let us get going with the inaugural session. I now request Mrs. Jaggi Mangat Panda, Director of Odisha Television Limited, Honorable Union Minister of State for Finance, Mr. Jayant Sinha, and Honorable Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, Mr. Arvind Panagaria, to come on stage for this session. The first speaker of this 6th edition of Foresight will be the Honorable Union Minister of State of Finance, Mr. Jayant Sinha. Mr. Sinha is the Union Minister of State for Finance in the Government of India. Our second speaker, an economist of international repute, Padma Vibhushan Dr. Arvind Panagaria, is the Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, the apex economic policy making body of the Indian government. Before we start this session, I would request the Director of Odisha Television Limited, Mrs. Jaggi Mangat Panda, to give an overview of Foresight.
Namaskar. OTV रो 6th annual convention Foresight रो एही कार्यक्रमकु मु आपण मानकु स्वागत करूची। ओटीवी रो मुख्य लक्ष्य होउची निरपेक्ष खबर कवर करिबा, जहा आमकु ओडिसा रे नंबर 1 न्यूज चैनल रो परिचय देइची। एथि पई ओडिसा आ ओडिसा बाहरे रहुथिबा हमर दर्शक मानकु मु धन्यवाद जणाउची। ओटीवी रो दीर्घ 18 इयर्स रो समय रे आमे बहुत गुडिये इनिशिएटिव नेइछु। ता भितरु गोटे मुख्य इनिशिएटिव होउची फोरसाइट, चेंजिंग टाइम्स चेंजिंग माइंड्स। गत 5 वर्ष रे आमे समाज रो बहुत गुडिये गुरुत्वपूर्ण विषय उपरे एही मंच रे आलोचना करि आसुछु। आउ एही मंच रे बहु विशिष्ट व्यक्ति माने आसी निजर मत रखिचंती। हमर एही प्रयास को दर्शक मानकर समर्थन मिलिची, जहा हमकु आहुरी आगु को बढ़िया पई प्रोत्साहित करिची आउ आगामी दिन रे आउ करिवो। Last 5 Foresight conventions, we have discussed issues from the world of politics, industry, art, cinema, and many other topics, both of state and national importance. At this year's Foresight, we have some very eminent speakers. Dr. Panagaria will speak on what we can learn from fast-growing nations. Shri Jayant Sinha will speak on the role of Eastern India in the national economic growth. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Panda. I now invite the Honorable Union Minister of State for Finance, Mr. Jayant Sinha, to deliver the keynote address on the issue, Role of Eastern India in the National Economic Growth Story, Roadmap for the Future.
Dr. Arvind Panagaria, Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, Srimati Jaggi Panda, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, and other people who have come to attend this session and also see it on television. I realized that as we think about Eastern India, it's not that we need to come up with different policies for what we're doing across India. We should do what we're doing, but only more so. So what I will do in today's talk is I'll touch on 3 topics. But first, let me start with what our core economic principles are. What are we really trying to accomplish as we decide on various individual policies and as we think about the framework for the budget as well. So ultimately what we are trying to do as far as India's economic growth is concerned is to build India's productive capacity. And what that means for Eastern India is to really raise India's productive capacity as well. And productive capacity includes both hard assets and soft assets. And the hard assets are roads, bridges, highways, ports. It means educational infrastructure, all of which is of great importance here in Eastern India. But it also means soft assets. And in some ways for Eastern India that is even more vital, because the soft assets includes the skills and employability of our young people. It means the strength of our economic institutions. And it means the innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem of the country. So it means all of those different things. And that's when we say we want to build India's productive capacity, Eastern India's productive capacity, we have to build the hard assets and the soft assets. And it's therefore a supply side, investment driven view of the world, not a demand side, consumption driven view of the world. For Eastern India, it's vitally important that we grow at 8, 9, 10% for decades. Only then are we going to be able to develop the full potential of Eastern India. So unless we are focused on the supply side, unless we are focused on productive capacity, we are not going to be able to transform Eastern India. So sustaining that fast growth by investing in productive capacity, investing on the supply side, that's really the way to transform this part of the country. Now people don't really realize this. Everybody looks at China or other East Asian countries and says they have been growing at 9% for decades. But actually if you look at South India and Western India, South Indian and Western India have also been growing at 8 or 9% for decades. So they have already sustained that fast growth for a long period of time. It is in Central India, which is Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Eastern India, that we have not been able to grow in that way. So we need to be able to grow fast, we have to build productive capacity, and that becomes vitally important for Eastern India. Because we are a pro-poor government, we are also a pro-market government. We are a pro-market government. And what that means is that unless our companies, our businesses, trade, commerce, unless that flourishes, we are not going to have the resources to be able to come up with sufficiently good pro-poor policies, allocate enough resources, and really lift the poor up from extreme poverty. A third very important policy making principle, and which is very, very important for Eastern India as well, is minimum government, maximum governance. That means that we need a rules-based, policy-driven, non-discretionary state. A state that sets up very clearly what is required to be able to operate effectively, to be able to operate in this region. And then with those very clear rules, with those very clear policies, then it is that businesses, through ease of doing businesses and so on, can flourish. And then the fourth very important principle that we follow is one of cooperative federalism. And here it's Honorable Prime Minister and of course under again the leadership of Dr. Panagaria that we are starting to work together to develop policies between the center and the states that can really enable the states to flourish. Because unless the states grow, unless Eastern India grows, the country as a whole cannot progress. So a very important priority for us for Eastern India's growth is connectivity across all dimensions. We are identifying important corridors, and I'm sure you're working on that in Odisha as well. We are identifying important corridors in Eastern India that we are going to connect up with highways. The second major area that we are working on is a series of social security programs like Jan Dhan, Jeevan Jyoti Bima, Suraksha Bima, universal health cover. These pro-poor policies, social security, will be vitally important for Eastern India to ensure that there is a robust safety net for everybody. The third very important area for us, which we are working on extensively from the last budget onwards, is in agriculture. Now we know that as far as agriculture is concerned, that irrigation is a vital driver towards being able to grow not one but 2 or 3 crops a year. So through the Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana, we are attempting to make sure that 60% of India's arable land that is not irrigated actually gets irrigation. Agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and in addition to that, what we can do in agro-processing industries becomes vitally important for this area as well. So that's the second major area after the social security programs that we have. Now the fourth area that we are working on is Make in India. And as part of Make in India, we have a number of industries in the Eastern India where, whether it is in iron and steel, in refining, aluminum, that we have to make sure that we have globally competitive industries. Eastern India is rich in resources, in talents, in temperate weather, in agricultural potential. Eastern India is rich, but our people are poor. It is all our collective responsibility to work together through these kinds of policies to be able to sustain fast growth over a long period of time so that we can give our people the quality of life that they deserve. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed being here with you all this evening.
Thank you very much for your views, Mr. Sinha. It is now time for the second keynote address of the inaugural session. How fast-growing nations have transformed and what can we learn from them? To speak on this issue, I now invite Mr. Arvind Panagaria, Honorable Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog.
Historically, of course, if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, countries that have transformed the United Kingdom, Germany, France, the United States, as feature of these economies is that all of these countries took a very, very long time to transform. So if you start around, say, 1950, look at India, China, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore. You can expand the list a little bit, but let me just go with that. These countries had very similar levels of per capita income. Today, it is not so. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, those three countries got off onto a double-digit growth very early in the game. All three of these about in the early 60s. And China a bit later in the early 1980s. And the result of that is that today, per capita incomes in those four countries are way, way higher, many times those of what we have here in India. There are about 5 features I'd like to distinguish that are common to the transformation of these countries. First of all, during this very rapid transformation, which basically took maybe no more than 3 decades, each of these countries saw its exports expand extremely rapidly. They also saw a very rapid growth in the labor-intensive industries. These are industries like the apparel, footwear, processing or assembly industries, food processing, industries that employ a lot of workers per unit of capital investment. So that was the second feature. The third was that there was very rapid decline in the share of agriculture in the GDP, accompanied by a very rapid rise in the shares of services and manufacturing. Simultaneously, a very rapid movement of the workforce out of agriculture into industry and services. Fourth, very rapid urbanization. And fifth, of course, which is truly, the ultimate objective of all that transformation, which is very rapid decline in poverty. Each of these countries, in fact, there was hardly any redistributive programs done to combat poverty. So, India being a democracy and these countries, certainly at the time, being authoritarian. In India, we have seen simultaneously with rising incomes the expansion and indeed proliferation of the social programs that try to redistribute income from those who are gaining in growth towards those who are coming up, getting pulled up less slowly. In these countries, actually, the entire transformation and elimination of the abject poverty happened pretty much through growth. Real wages, as I said, rose about 9 to 10% a year, and workers kind of moved to take advantage of these high real wages, and the rest of it they figured out themselves. But one of the key features where I see these countries actually were very successful at, India so far has not been successful at, is what I'm going to emphasize. Distinguishing feature is that in each of these cases, actually, what you observe, broadly at least, in the industries, all these labor-intensive kind of industries which create a lot of employment, the large-scale firms grew rapidly. They flourished. So even if the firms started small, the firms didn't necessarily start large. They started small. The successful ones really became large rapidly. So today in India, if you look at firms that are 20 workers or less, the small firms, they employ about 73% of the workforce this is the manufacturing sector. 73% of the manufacturing workforce, they contribute only 13 or 14% of the output of manufacturing. So these are lots of very low productivity firms, and productivity has to rise. In terms of strategy, what lesson do we see? What did China really do to get where it got? Now remember, again, 1980, if you start out, per capita income in India was higher than the per capita income in China. Then China kind of switched its policies and completely broke away from the Indian growth process at the time. And today, of course, China's per capita income is 3 to 4 times ours. That is the big difference. So on the coast, it created these special economic zones. Along the coast, you see 4 or 5 very focused special economic zones where basically provided good infrastructure. They provided good flexible labor laws, flexible land laws, and that, of course, allowed the foreign investors. And really, I think the investors that came into these places were from either Hong Kong or from Taiwan, who already were experiencing very high wages, and therefore they were looking for a place to go to. Just as today, most of the large investors, multinational investors, particularly in China, in view of the rising wages in China, are looking for another cheaper base. Some of them are going to Vietnam, some are going to even Bangladesh, and hopefully, though, the true destination of those movements could be India. One figure that The Economist has quoted on total exports, Gujarat today exports about 22% of India's total exports. For now, so I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking views and deliberation, Mr. Panagaria. We have come to the end of the inaugural session of Foresight 2016. The second session will begin after this break.